Really pleased to, on a snowy day, to have a good audience here for a talk by Christopher Archibald. I'd just like to introduce Christopher for a moment, a PhD student studying modern environmental history at Concordia University, but also, I should add, an affiliate of the Gorsebrook Research Institute here at St. Mary's. His research focuses on the city of Sydney, Nova Scotia in the second half of the 20th century and early years of the new millennium, and examines how Sydney residents understood industrial pollution. The research has been supported by SHORC and FQRSC doctoral fellowships, and since basing himself in Halifax, Chris has been affiliated, as I said, with Gorsebrook Research Institute. Thanks for coming today, Chris.
Thank you, Tony. And thanks everyone for coming out on what's amounted to maybe the final snowstorm of the season. We'll see. So I'd like to begin. There's a bit of an introduction, trying to situate this story, and then I'll move into actually narrating some events that occurred on Frederick Street in Sydney in the late 1990s. This research is taken from a PhD dissertation chapter, so it's sort of plucked it out of something, so hopefully it stands well on its own today. So a few weeks ago, I listened as Emily Chapman discussed how toxins, particularly mercury, generated by 19th century gold extraction, continue to exist and pose a threat to humans and local ecological systems. Her talk examined how the addition of selenium may offer a means of neutralizing mercury. At least that's what I took away from it. And today I'm shifting the focus away from thinking about toxins in terms of biochemistry and offering reflections on how non-experts from working class communities have interpreted environmental pollutants as threatening to their bodily health. I focus on a group of Frederick Street's residents in Sydney, Nova Scotia during 1998 and 1999, who lived adjacent to a polluted landscape made so by a pre-existing coke industry. So, today we talk about, where are you? Frederick Street, which is just below the Sydney Port Access Road. And this space up there,
there's a pointer there if you want.
right. So this area here held at one point coke ovens for much of the 20th century, from the early 1901, 1903 thereabouts until 1988 when it stopped, when it was shut down. And that coking industry provided coke for fuel for a steel mill, which was located here. So this entire area was devoted to steel industry. So for much of the 20th century, Sydney on Nova Scotia's Cape Breton Island was home to a steel mill, in more recent modern years known as Sydney Steel. And coke itself is simply coal that has been baked in airtight ovens to excessive heat and then cooled through a water quenching process. And that was needed as fuel for the production of steel. Sydney Steel operation powered the city's economy. It provided the city an identity, and it employed generations of steel workers and coke workers who lived in the neighborhoods bordering the mill. Steel and coke production, but particularly coke production, also infused the city's physical environment with heavy levels of pollution. Until the late 80s, when the coke oven ceased operation, the production of coke had released a brew of toxic byproducts including polyaromatic hydrocarbons, commonly referred to as PAHs, and benzylpyrene. These are both known carcinogens. And that sort of released down into the physical environment. By cooling the coke through quenching it in the water became contaminated. It kind of then drizzled down into the landscape. Much of it eventually made its way into a brook that's not shown here, but meandered something like that. And it carried the sort of coal tar runoff down into this area, and that's what became known as the Sydney tar ponds, which were quite prominent in the news in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and the remediation just finished up of that site in 2014. So despite the highly polluted environment that came about as a result of this industrial pollution or production, my research has shown that prior to the late 80s, there was little concern amongst local residents for the impact of this pollution on their well-being. Interviews with residents of Sydney who have spent their lives in the city, or who spent their youth in the city but moved away in the late 70s, early 80s, reveal that people in Sydney remember industrial pollution as having been an annoyance. They tend to characterize the pollution as having been dirt, but not a threat to public health. Among the steel workers, atmospheric pollution was eventually recognized as problematic, but not before their jobs were on the line due to workforce downsizing and the mill being modernized, and the coke ovens closing. At that time, the tar ponds were also recognized as a threat to lobster populations in Sydney Harbour, and that really sort of set off environmentalists within Sydney who really began vocalizing concerns about proposals to clean up that site via incineration. So those stories are important, and I get to them as part of my PhD research, but today I want to recount how residents of Frederick Street interpreted their own physiological health to be connected to the environment, which they knew to be heavily polluted. So in this talk, I aim to explain how concerns for people's health stimulated environmental activism within a group of people, several of whom confessed to having no interest in such matters prior to the emergence of their health problems. As I recount the story of Frederick Street, assembled through interviews with some of its former residents, media coverage and government documents, we'll see how residents identified their health to be adversely affected by toxins in the landscape. The conclusion they achieved through observations of their body, of surrounding wildlife, and of how government employees interacted with the landscape. These residents came to see themselves as intimately connected to the environment around them and identified the presence of chemicals extracted and derived from coal or coke as problematic. This realization frightened them and stimulated a great deal of anger, but also cynicism towards government. For its part, the province, which had been also the owner of Sydney Steel in its latter decades of operation, initially refused to relocate Frederick Street residents. And although other Sydney residents also advocated the impacts of a polluted environment at the same time, I'm focusing on Frederick Street because their case study, I think, offers some interesting insights on understanding how they came to relate their physical health as primarily shaped by environmental contaminants. Although they recognized the presence of other health determinants, they argued that it was the environment sullied by the area's heavy industry that made them sick. So an environmental determinant was key for these people. The principal organizers on Frederick Street also seem to have been somewhat oblivious to the broader concerns surrounding the link between environmental pollution and health prior to this date that we're going to get to shortly. There were other groups active in Sydney at the time. There was something referred to as the Joint Action Group, which was a government-sponsored and community-based organization convened in the mid-1990s and was active during the Frederick Street campaign. A subgroup of that organization was aimed specifically at making sense of the health impacts of industrial pollution. And while this group did not address the physical pollution in Sydney, the remediation was ultimately done by the federal government. Its existence provided a forum for public debate surrounding health and environmental issues. And Frederick Street residents did eventually engage in this forum, using it as a means of publicizing their concerns. Their engagement with the environmental debates in Sydney stemmed from their personal experiences that we're going to look at. The Frederick Streets campaign ultimately became quite a flashpoint in the media as well, attracting provincial and national attention to Sydney and around these issues that the city was going through at that time. So my interpretation on this whole story is shaped by what environmental historians have referred to as the ecological body, the concept that human bodies are porous and susceptible to toxins inhabiting and migrating throughout the natural world. The approach situates non-human substances or organisms in this story, industrial pollutants, into historical narratives as actors in their own right. I'm choosing to analyze the accounts of bodily experiences in this story as a mixture of both cultural constructions, coming out of Foucault, but also as physical sources of evidence, so that we need to look at these things together. Okay, so to Frederick Street. So on the southern boundary of Sydney's Whitney Pier neighborhood is Frederick Street. The street's modest wooden homes stood the closest to the coke ovens when they were operational, and during the decades when they were working, clouds of smoke and vapor from the quenching process wafted over the homes on the street. A railroad is kind of in parallel with the Sydney Port Access Road, sliced across the landscape and differentiated industrial from residential space. Fine coal dust from the train's coal trucks drifted over the street each time the train rumbled past. The dead-end residential street was also permeated with odors from a municipal landfill, which was located sort of up that area, towards the end of the street. Those new to the street in the mid-1980s enjoyed relatively cheap property and hoped that these homes would increase in value, particularly after the cessation of the coke industry in 1988. In 1998, there are some efforts done to begin remediating the coke ovens property. And a preliminary step was digging up remaining coal and selling that off somewhere else. And that excavation disturbed contaminants, and these people feel ultimately affected their health. So in the spring of 1998, a Frederick Street resident named Juanita McKenzie, who along with her husband and two daughters had moved to the street a little over a decade earlier, was intrigued to see a man in a white outfit posting a sign to a new chain-link fence surrounding the coke oven property. Where did I put that? The fence had been erected to restrict residents' access to the site, which had been publicly acknowledged as contaminated. Curious, she approached him and also realized that he was wearing a white hazmat suit complete with a mask. the sign said human health hazard. I guess this one says do not trespass. Other signs said do not enter. Juanita's neighbor, Debbie Ouellette, had a similar experience, having observed the man as she hung her laundry to dry. Looking up, Ouellette remembers seeing men in white suits erecting a fence and adorning it with human health hazard signs. I didn't know what that meant, she explains of the new fence and signage, but the workers' protective clothing alarmed her. So these white hazmat suits, examples of alarmed residents who characterized the protective garment as spacesuits, an analogy that situated the pseudo workers as operating in a hostile atmosphere where natural forces conspired against the vulnerable human. The analogy was popular amongst those who observed the protected employees and accurately embodied the concerns that the suits conveyed upon residents. What dangers were the employees being suited against? Furthermore, the suits with accompanying masks implied that whatever hazard the workers were protecting themselves against could access unprotected humans through dermal absorption or the respiratory system. The risk of engaging with the environmental hazards through a respiratory exchange meant the toxins were mobile, and although residents might not be able to wander the contaminated site due to the fence, perhaps those contaminants could travel to them. The construction of the fence upset Juanita, Debbie, and others who were alarmed that human health hazards in the form of environmental contaminants existed just behind the fence. To them, the chain link fence offered no barrier to protect against toxins, which the workers' spacesuits heavily suggested were mobile. If the large, now fenced grounds of the coke ovens were contaminated, then why, the ladies wondered, would the property line halt the contaminant? From their perspective, the fence that was to keep residents safe by restricting their exposure to the contaminated site appeared arbitrary when considered alongside the contaminant's mobility. As Juanita recalls, I came home and at the very end of Frederick Street, I saw this guy in a white outfit and he's putting up a sign that said human health hazard. I thought to myself, they know something. Like, what do they know that I don't? And why are they dressed like that when I'm on the other side of the fence? By 2001, fencing and signage comparable to the last slide was present throughout Sydney in order to prevent people from accessing the coke ovens, but also what we showed earlier as being the tar ponds. And the conclusions people drew were similar to what they found on Frederick Street. Also, property testing for contaminants, environmental testing, showed that many people's properties held contaminants, and this solidified their belief that these things were mobile. Apprehensive about the implications of fence and discomforted by the lasting image of the spacesuited worker, Juanita invited her neighbors into her home to discuss the issue. 6 households were present at the meeting, and they dubbed themselves the Six-Pack. As a result of this meeting at Juanita's house, it became obvious that these neighbors and their families were all experiencing symptoms of illness. And they say it was all of our families, especially the children. It was like someone said something about headaches and sore throats, upset stomachs, diarrhea, skin rashes, blood disorders. It was just phenomenal. Every one of us, our children or us. Juanita's own children had nosebleeds, kidney infections, and bladder infections, blood in the urine. It was horrible, she explained to me when I spoke with her. Debbie suffered excruciating headaches coupled with lethargy and speculated that maybe she had a brain tumor. Confronted with their collective suffering, the known presence of toxins a stone's throw away, and the image of hazmat suits, the 6 households concluded that the contaminants from the coke ovens had infiltrated their bodies and were making them sick. That the neighbors' symptoms diminished when they went to work, ran errands, or otherwise left Frederick Street tended to further reinforce the perspective. Attributing the recent experiences of malaise to the disturbance of the toxins during the excavation of coal on the coke oven site, residents succeeded in having site excavation halted, vowing to form a human chain should the project resume. In an effort to obtain evidence of how unhealthy the street's residents were, Juanita compiled an informal survey that revealed the rate of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and other illnesses on the street. She sought personal information from the collective memory of neighbors, went to the library, dug through past media. She ultimately compiled a bit of a chart which showed a high rate of premature death in the immediate vicinity. And she told me, I did enough research to know that every place on that street there had been a death, and it had been recently, like within a 10 to 15 year span. Juanita's study was taken in an effort to gain some kind of an amount of authoritative data supportive of her concerns, and she presented it at her community meeting, where her morose findings were dismissed as a result of an unhealthy lifestyle. The dueling narratives of environment and lifestyle, somewhat akin to the nature versus nurture debate, were common in Sydney and factored heavily in local discussions surrounding cancer. Sydney's prolific and widely publicized cancer rate formed a backdrop against which environmental concerns were situated. From the mid-1980s, public health research revealed cancer incidence to be higher in Sydney than elsewhere in Nova Scotia, the province with the highest cancer rate in Canada. Environmental activists seeking to demonstrate that the community as a whole suffered from a factor unique to Sydney pointed to the high rates of cancer. Coke oven workers in the late 1980s and early 1980s, or 1990s, and now Juanita and her neighbors pointed to the lingering pollution associated with Sydney Steel and that coking process. Another Sydney personality, Eric Brophy, also demonstrated the prevalence of cancer in Sydney by driving visitors and journalists around on what one journalist referred to as a macabre tour, where he identified the homes of past cancer victims. The tour started at his own home where his wife had died and then progressed throughout the community. Brophy himself was very convinced that there is something linking with environment and cancer, and he wrote Canada's Minister for Health, stating, I embarked on a search for answers to the question of why so many of our loved ones were dying at such an early age and in astounding numbers to cancer and heart disease. I believed then, as I do now, that lifestyles was part of the problem, but perhaps more so was the contamination that came from the stacks of the steel industry in concert with the coking and byproduct plants, such as these coke ovens. That opinion was not without merit. Public health studies reviewing the high rates of cancer in Sydney noted that occupational exposure to industrial pollutants associated with steel and coke production were a probable culprit in the community's high cancer mortality. Scientific literature focusing on Sydney also noted that the community's socioeconomic context and its rate of cigarette smoking needed to be factored into understanding rates of cancer. But simply, any explanation of Sydney's cancer rate was multifaceted. Within the public realm of activism and politics, that multi-causal explanation tended to break down as debates positioned environment and lifestyle in stark opposition. A 1987 provincial study correlating unhealthy lifestyle with cancer and heart disease and recommending a greater consumption of broccoli became derisively known in Sydney as the broccoli study. For those like Juanita who were intent on demonstrating the pollutants and social injustice that community members were forced to live with, any mention of the lifestyle narrative tended to undermine her agenda and downplayed the risks associated with the area's industrial pollution. Likewise, the provincial government, leery of being saddled with compensation and establishing precedent, emphasized individual factors like diet and cigarette smoking. Over the spring and summer of 1998, Frederick Street residents identified signs and symptoms indicating that the environmental contaminants from mobile had surpassed the fence line and were migrating into their homes and yards, getting ever closer to their domestic space. In addition to citing their own illnesses, the concerned residents pointed to visual evidence on and around their properties and within their basements. For example, during the hot summer of 1998, the residents discovered a black tarry substance bubbling from a rail bed that paralleled the street. Debbie also discovered an odd yellow liquid seeping from the bank of the brook that flowed behind her home, and furthermore, the brook was orange and released strong odors. We have a sort of brook. Maybe? All right, it's an orange brook.
Is it frozen? Frozen, is it?
I think. Maybe. There.
Okay.
There's our orange brook. And she was anxious that these bright colors, I guess it's kind of visible, indicate contaminants, or that there's something wrong there. And so she had Environment Canada test the water. Early summer rains flooded the brook and spread that orange liquid across her lawn, and which was particularly disconcerting when Environment Canada came back and revealed in early June that the seepage discovered on the brook's bank contained elevated levels of arsenic. Frequently associated with rat poison, arsenic is a naturally occurring element often found in coal. It is also a known carcinogen and has a history of serving as an administrative and accidental poison. Arsenic's reputation distressed Debbie, who worried for the safety of her children. The poor condition of local animals also factored into the group's growing collection of circumstantial evidence. On Frederick Street, there was a small farm, a hobby farm, I guess, and anyway, there's a cow there. And it was a 3-horned cow with tumors covering its body. And the creature's deformities seem to offer proof of the contaminant's impact. Deformed mice discovered in traps around homes, misshapen toads, and improperly configured birds offered further proof, as did the pet dogs that suffered and died from a range of cancerous tumors. As concerns spread within Sydney, other citizens also drew parallels between the oddities in the animal population and the presence of industrial contaminants. Neela McQueen, who lived near the tar ponds in Sydney's North End, attributed polydactyl cats in her neighborhood with being symptomatic of the area's pollution. So polydactyl, they're the ones that have more fingers than most cats do. These deaths, and then also she pointed to her dog and her cat, dog died of cancer, cat due to kidney problems, as also indicative of the pollutants' impact. These deaths were emotional affairs for the family, and yet they also received quite a bit of attention in the media. Most prominent was a dog named Barney, who was known to romp amongst the tar ponds and then allegedly glowed in the dark. Now that came out in 1998, the year in which Frederick Street activists were piecing together all this evidence. They were also getting a whole lot of attention at this point in the press. And so Barney appeared in national press as a radiant symbol of the area's environmental health, or lack thereof. Frederick Street residents and other citizens concerned with the state of Sydney's environmental contamination blamed the government for the state of the environment because the province had been the owner of the steel industry from '68 until its closure. The province actively avoided the notion that environmental hazards could move into residential areas and impact the well-being of the citizenry. The province's denial of the responsibility facilitated suspicion and distrust amongst these residents. They interpreted the government's resistance as a form of social injustice, and a broad distrust for the state manifested itself within many of Sydney's residents. That distrust, combined with the stress that accompanied the realization that their living environment was, and perhaps had always been, dangerous, made the issue highly emotional and increasingly contentious within the community. The summer of '98 also saw the Frederick Street group gain the support and sympathy of the Sierra Club. Elizabeth May, at the time executive director of the Sierra Club, our present leader of the Green Party in Canada, instructed the six-pack to keep their plight prominent in the media. Juanita embraced this advice. She built up a list of contacts of people she could contact across Canada, and had a fairly strong push in keeping this within the papers, on television. Prominent media coverage such as Canadian television networks' investigative feature W5 introduced the six-pack to Canadian audiences. W5's story summarized the residents' fight to achieve recognition, the emotional and physical trauma associated with their exposure to toxins, and the litany of evidence that they had assembled. The show included footage of interviews with members of the six-pack and the province's chief medical officer, showed footage of their homes, of their environment, of the brook. There was a dead fish floating in one shot. Sympathetic against coverage, the reporting accepted and relayed to national audiences the residents' anxiety around this issue of mobility. People living outside of Nova Scotia watching this, some of them with ties to Sydney, wrote letters of support that appear within the Joint Action Group's record. Support, but also an acceptance of this perspective. Not everyone, however, accepted the idea of environmental hazards existing or impacting residential areas. In fact, some neighbors on Frederick Street and throughout the community dismissed people like Juanita, who demanded relocation from the street. One frustrated and anonymous individual criticized the activists as, quote, only complainers and troublemakers, interested in the media spotlight and looking for a way out and, of course, a new home and money. On Laurier Street, which is just 2 blocks north of Frederick Street and paralleling Curry's Lane, a man named Joe Pettipaw lived. Now, Joe had spent his life in that area, grew up playing street hockey in the clouds of the coke ovens emissions, and he and his wife had lived on Frederick Street when they were first married and observed nothing alarming or out of the ordinary. To him, coal dust and smelly smoke were part of the surroundings. We didn't complain about anything, Joe explained, and that's why we were so skeptical about what Juanita Mackenzie and her group were doing. Joe was equipped with years of experience of living in this area, and he attributed Juanita and Debbie's concerns to their inexperience of living in the shadow of heavy industry, or perhaps at this point the legacy of heavy industry. Their demands for relocation, he initially reasoned, were part of a dubious and selfish agenda, wherein, again, this idea of selling the homes for profit came up. Juanita and Debbie, relatively new to the pier, remember Juanita had moved there in the mid-80s, and unsympathetic neighbors interpreted their complaints as criticism of a community that was proud of its industrial heritage. Juanita experienced animosity as she worked to keep her complaints in the press. She told me that eggs were thrown at her house. She received anonymous threatening phone calls. Apparently she received death threats. To lifelong residents, she told me, I was an outsider, I didn't belong to the pier, so who was I to move into the pier and start saying bad things about it? I got slammed pretty hard. I mean, they hated us. Yet convinced of her cause, Juanita persisted, intent on saving her neighbors, her family. And by her account, many of her neighbors, like Joe Petitpas, had little interest in concerns about this relationship between toxins and their health. The discrepancy between the six-pack's concerns and the hostile reaction from neighbors suggests a pervasive influence of the working class identity with roots and that identity being tied to the steel and coal industry from where the pollution originated. And that theme is explored more in my work, but there's a strong resistance there where you begin to question these environmental pollutants that starts to cast doubt on the industry and what Sydney was as a town, as a steel town. Eventually, the provincial government decided to move the Frederick Street residents, but not because of health concerns. On May 13, 1999, about a year after Debbie and Juanita first made their concerns public, the Provincial Executive Council met and decided upon a course of action that ultimately saw the majority of the street's residents offered bio packages. The decision to proceed with a relocation and an eventual buyout was ultimately made around the height following the discovery of arsenic in residents' basements. Arsenic, a naturally occurring element, we mentioned, was often found around coal. Now, around 2006, a broad voluntary study of residential properties surrounding Sydney Steel and the tar ponds by Canada's Public Works Department looked at contaminants on properties and found arsenic. Yet, when I spoke with some of those Public Works employees, they noted that the location of arsenic correlated with the historic location of coal pile storage piles in the yard because coal was burned as a domestic heating fuel in Sydney. So that maybe these contaminants, at least for some Sydney properties, was the result of, was not an industrial related issue, but was a product of domestic life. This is Juanita in her basement, and you can sort of see the seat they're pointing to there. The provincial government was careful to avoid making any statements linking the bio packages and health risks. Briefing notes provided for an early November meeting state, the buyout offer was voluntary and was not made because of any health risks. Rather, the document explained, because some residents had found material in their basements that was similar to contaminants found close to the coke oven site, that the buyout occurred so that a, quote, very comprehensive and intrusive study around the homes as well as the coke oven site, end quote, could be performed. and then said that recognizing the disruption this may cause to the residents' lives, we've offered to purchase the homes. Aware that audiences and the affected citizens were unlikely to view the presence of arsenic in basements as simply an environmental question and not a health issue, official government communications stressed that the provincial chief medical officer of health had reviewed the testings and concluded that levels of metals found in the basements do not pose a health threat. He went on to sort of qualify that by saying, unless you're exposed to huge amounts of this, such as if you were ingesting it, if you're swallowing it. The Bulletin's announcement that arsenic levels did not pose a threat to inhabitants demonstrates how the government politically employed the authority of experts and these multi-causal explanations frequently associated with health and environmental concerns, multi-causal explanations of science, to divest itself of the responsibility and liability associated with the contaminants. By the end of October, the province had purchased 13 residential properties. And although residents were relieved to leave the contamination behind, leaving their homes was, of course, an emotional affair. They had sold, they weren't coming back. The specter of the contaminants' health impacts continued for the Frederick Street Group beyond their buyout, and for central organizers Debbie Ouellette and Juanita McKenzie, illness continued to evidence the area's environmental contamination. Although they welcomed the ultimate buyout and were pleased to leave the polluted environment behind, health-related problems in subsequent years did little to dampen either Juanita or Debbie's anger or distrust towards the government, or to weaken their belief that the living environment had been a threat. Juanita and her family ultimately experienced a series of tragic health issues. In the year following Frederick Street, Juanita found herself ill with cancer, which left her without a kidney. A few years later, her eldest daughter was diagnosed with colorectal cancer that had spread to her liver, and that she had 4 to 6 months left to live. Shortly before Juanita's eldest slipped into unconsciousness, she asked, "Mom, did Frederick Street do this to me?" While Juanita's reply was a non-committal, "I don't know," she blames her daughter's death, her own cancer, and her youngest daughter's recent hysterectomy upon their contaminated Frederick Street living environment. Ultimately, she says, "I feel that what happened to them and what happened to me was a product of government's ignorance and neglect, and I will always hold them responsible for my daughter's death and for everything that's happened to me." Debbie made a similar argument, pointing to her daughter's case of cancer, her own tumors, as evidence of the long-term impact that living on Frederick Street had on health. For these women, exposure to historical industrial pollution had manifested itself by times fatally within their own bodies and those of their loved ones. The buyout of willing residents on Frederick Street lent legitimacy to the Frederick Street Group's assessment. After a year of ongoing media presence at the local and national levels, the Six-Pack's assertions that the toxins from the extinct coking process were causing them illness and that those contaminants were mobile within the landscape were addressed. Despite the government's official stance that the buyout was not contingent upon health concerns and that the issue was an environmental matter, the decision to purchase Frederick Street properties following so closely upon the discovery of arsenic in basements suggested otherwise. Furthermore, for the activists and their sympathetic audiences, an environmental issue was also a health issue. Their campaign had clearly argued that the two were intertwined. Many in Sydney, and particularly those living close to Frederick Street, perceived the relocation to be the result of a health threat. Joe Pettipaw, the one who had initially dismissed the six-pack's concerns, reevaluated his outlook as he sought to understand why would government move an entire street. After all, Pettipaw exclaimed, the government doesn't move people because they like them. There's got to be something wrong here. In an interview with Pettipaw, I inquired about the relocation of these residents, and he revealed yet another government narrative that continued to ignore the question of health. And he recalls meeting with government officials who explained to him that the Frederick Street properties were purchased because the area would be needed as a staging ground for remediation work on the coke oven site. These inconsistent narratives contributed to cynicism and distrust amongst Sydney residents who were convinced that health problems were primarily the result of this pollution. Where are we at for?
Maybe a few more minutes
Yeah.
and then questions.
Yeah. So by the beginning of the 21st century, many residents in Sydney perceived this environmental contaminants and toxins associated with coke ovens and the tar ponds to be threats to their personal health and well-being. Citizens drafted and submitted correspondence to public officials expressing these concerns. Landlords with homes bordering the tar ponds sort of worried that renters would look elsewhere. And they actually requested that maybe the government should do something to help compensate them by a tax measure or something like this. Some affluent residents accepted a financial loss as property prices dropped in the area and moved elsewhere in Sydney. Come back to Neela McQueen, who we had met earlier. She was skeptical about the effectiveness of the fencing to protect local people from tar ponds, and she discovered in 1999 that she had cancer. So following a corrective operation in 2000, she began paying greater attention to issues of health and environment in Sydney, and she ended up meeting Debbie Ouellette and others environmental activists in Sydney, and these people began to, I guess, the environmentalist presence in Sydney grew. So within Sydney in the 1990s, the Frederick Street activists were, as I pointed out earlier, not alone in expressing their anxiety for the environmental pollution that became an unwanted legacy of the city's industrial heritage. But examining their stories reveals that they were initially alarmed by visuals that suggested something was amiss with their living environment, and that they were motivated to pursue an activist approach by concerns for their and their loved ones' well-being. Their relocation provided legitimacy to their claims of being affected by those contaminants and suggested to concerned publics within Sydney, but also elsewhere for those watching, looking on, that there was indeed something hazardous about industrial pollution that remained in the area. At the same time, we see that this argument that they made was controversial within the community. It led to a lot of tensions between neighbors, and it was a source of strain between citizenry and the provincial government. So that's, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And we do have a few minutes for questions, comments.
beginning, but the way in which really there was very little awareness of these issues until the 90s. And in the context that in rural Cape Breton, a very young Elizabeth May was leading the fight against budworm spraying toxins. And it just makes me wonder why. I mean, did nobody actually make a connection, or was it simply that it was too soon after the 1967 episode when it looked as if thousands of jobs were going to be lost in Sydney?
I think that it's more what you hit on latter. That if we look at, I do look at the labor side of things in another chapter, and what I saw was that that the threat of closure of the mill, which led to the province taking over Sydney Mill, that really alarmed the community, and that everyone sort of needed to do what they could to keep this mill going, and we needed to make, to an extent, sacrifices. Now, whether those were environmental sacrifices, well, no, they were, because there was some amount of concern in the 70s. There were a couple sort of screechy voices saying that, something that, well, questioning atmospheric pollution. It was not questioning ground pollution at this point. The issue is atmospheric pollution and emissions from this coke-making process. And they got shut down. In fact, there's an account where someone brought this issue up at a union meeting, and the story is that they were sort of booed out of the hall. And the mill also, sort of general narrative is that it also did not modernize in comparison to other mills elsewhere. So in comparison to like what was going up on and up in Hamilton, there are accounts of employees from Sydney going to Hamilton as part of training measures and saying, well, I don't even recognize what you guys are doing. Like, that's a whole other thing. And the lack of modernization appears to be due to the financial constraints and this desperate effort to make the mill show a profit. Right?
Yeah, just a question about the water, I guess. Was the entire city's water supply considered polluted, and did they kind of switch to bottled water? They try to filter it out, or what was the implications?
No, the water supply itself came from uphill of this area. Sydney didn't take water out of Margaret Creek. They dumped sewage into that area, but their water supply came from away. And I did encounter, in talking to people in the community interviews, some people kind of raise thoughts that maybe because water lines move through this environment, that maybe who knows what they're picking up. But it didn't seem to be, it was more of a reflective thought that emerged as they were explaining their memories of pollution. There doesn't seem to have been any campaign around that. And when we think that water moves through a city under pressure, when it usually water leaves pipes rather than seeping back into it. No bottled water advised.
Thank you for your presentation. 2 questions for you. Hopefully, the first one will be short. The cancer rates for Sydney how does that, the data through time look? Does it go up or down? And then my second question is, the coke itself, is that from the mines of Cape Breton? Perhaps there's other reasons why there was such desire to have that mill continue because of the industry linkage with coal. Because if the mill were to shut down, perhaps other jobs would be lost in Cape Breton.
With cancer, there's a study being done right now by there's a cancer sort of specialist, Ron McCormick in Sydney, and he's been there since Ron's been there since the early 90s, I believe, and he's been kind of watching this, and so we should have. There should be some kind of answer, I would think, coming soon. But anecdotally speaking, it seems that it's. I'm not a physician, so I don't know that I can't comment for sure on the declining or stabilizing or. But there is a paper he's in the process of publishing where he looks at this this idea of a link between industrial workplace safe health and cancer, and so we'll see what comes there. I can direct you to that. With regards to the coal and the coke, coke comes from coal. The coal used in the steel mill was initially Cape Breton coal. That changes at different points in time depending upon markets, but also Cape Breton coal had a very high sulfur content, and that produced problems for the coke production by times, and so there was a point. I'd have to look at notes and stuff to give you dates, but where they were blending with other coals, and yeah, there is also at one point it wasn't just the coke ovens there. There was a whole industry built around the coke ovens until somewhere in the 50s, I believe. That was very prominent, especially during the wartime eras, manufacturing chemicals for explosives and all manner of wonderful things came out of there. Petroleum, oils, but that declines, and ultimately these byproduct industries leave. When they leave, there's no use for that byproduct, and there are accounts, and it appears that with the exception of some of the gas that would have come out of that was used in firing the mill, a lot of those byproducts just the tap was open and they're drained out into the sort of open sewers, which as coke ovens broke, which flowed down into and created the tar ponds.
We just have time for, I think, one more question if you'd like to go ahead.
The question, the dog that was glowing in the dark, that's fascinating. But that sounds more like radiation or something. Is it heavy metal that he's ingesting, or do you have any idea?
I don't know.
Because the people weren't glowing, right? It was just the dog?
No, there were no glowing people.
But they're all mammals, right? Ingesting the
yeah.
metal.
I don't know, Heather. I mean, I look at this story of the dog as it's sort of further ramped up the anxiety, and people, look, there's a glowing dog, right? And I'm not saying, I don't mean to dismiss these people's perceptions here. I mean, they're very convinced of some of this, and well thought out. The dog thing, I did talk to a fellow who served as communications for the city Tarpon agency, and which was a government organization that was sort of working towards deal with contamination in the area. And he said, this dog story was, he said this was bogus, right? But I don't know, all what I've got is these 2 or 3, I think it came out in some Toronto paper, not the Globe, but maybe the Star or the Sun, and then it got picked up, and then it became sort of popular lore.
But there was a 3-horned cow.
Yeah, and they were going to Juanita couldn't find her pictures. I mean, that was now over, it was almost 15 years ago or something. So when I was talking to her, she'd moved several times since the relocation, and I've had all, and she couldn't find the picture for me. But
so there's no glowing people.
No, not that I've been told of.
And if I can add to that quickly, and it's not that uncommon for cows to be born with 3 horns. It does happen. It's not unheard of without contaminants being in the picture. I wouldn't be able to interpret that without analyzing the cow itself to see what would have been the cause. For the dog, it's possible that the dog got into paint or fertilizer with phosphorus within that fertilizer, and sometimes that causes glowing at night. And your comment, Chris, of the anxiety of seeing this, just expands that story of the anxiety. But radiation normally does not cause glowing. Some compounds, but not normally from radioactive materials.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and just with the polydactyl cats, with like 6 or 7 thumbs or whatever, she told me this, and I'm like, oh, like, cause look at all these, and then I went and looked up and I learned the word polydactyl, and that this is a thing in cats, and as sort of an unrelated aside, but these cats were once prized as being for their mousing abilities. Apparently, according to various internet sources, on ships, and so they often showed up in port areas, and they do seem to be more prevalent in some communities than in others, but they're not. It doesn't. Yeah, they're not just specific to Sydney. They're you see them elsewhere.
I should close things off, I think, just for the sake of time, and just quick note first. Our talk next week is about growing more grass in Nova Scotia. I just want to highlight that's, so take that for what, it's a very topical topic now, growing grass. That's Wednesday next week, so the next 2 talks are Wednesdays at the same time, 11:30, but next week's is in Burke 207, if anybody wants to be there for Emily Peters' talk. Chris, this was fascinating, and thanks so much for presenting to us, and if anybody does have any more questions, I'm sure we'll be here for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.